the affect connection to the instinctive pressure, so it's felt consciously, is what generates, for me anyway, method writing. So long as I can receive the affect, there's no writer's block. But as you say, pardon me, that's draining, because there's a tendency to experience everything you're writing, at least at the intensity of a very strong, gripping dream, where there is a visceral sense of the affect and of the relationships in the dream. Then it's similar to that. At least, sometimes the emotions are incredibly overwhelming, and it's real, and it's fully ego engulfed, should we say, or it fully engulfs the ego, and it is tough. But then the process of working it through is a little bit like the Freudian idea of working through a dream, in that as you go through it, you are integrating what it's trying to say. And with respect to complexes getting in the way, yeah, I fully understand that. And the technique that I've developed is to put the complexes into the narrative. And to do that, we have to do, or I have to do, what I tell other people not to do in waking life, which is to reify them. So we turn them into characters that operate within the narrative, and they're contained by the narrative, and not then just free to run around inside the psyche as reified characters. They are contained, so they're given space to perform, but they're trapped within that. And I can engage with them when they're trapped in the narrative, and then they don't bother me outside of it. And that's a kind of a mix of the Eastern method of using mandalas in some tantric practices, where you entrap the wrathful deities inside a mandala, and they can operate within there, but their energy is constrained by the mandala, and they can't get out of it. You can enter into it and you can leave it, and they're stuck there. So I use the narrative, or I try. This is the ideal state anyway. I try to capture the complexes, put them into narrative form, and leave them in there. But there is obviously an investment of energy, and it is draining in the process of doing that. But they get the benefit, apparently, of having a workout within a narrative story. But then they also get the disadvantage of having themselves essentially broken down by the narrative when the narrative successfully completes itself. So it's very close to dream work then, as Freud understood it, the processing out of things. You get the abreactive element too, when in a method writing sense, you feel it. You feel a life you've not lived, but you know it's in the narrative. And in that sense, for me, it's different from a fantasy that you might have, which then takes over the ego and intrudes into the waking life. So it utilizes a lot of things. It utilizes internal projection as well, because the narrative then utilizes our natural tendency to do that internally, to capture it within an internal narrative, which is then projected into the external reference of that. So what is within, so too is without. And it's a powerfully psychodynamic process. And also, if you work with the narrative, if you separate from an ego identification, even though you feel it, say I'll say the lead character, the lead character tends to draw ego identifications for anybody, any writer. But if you separate from that while still feeling it, that means you can move out. But at the same time, the ego identified with complexes are almost obliged to turn up, because the ego is in a state, as I say, which is near dreamlike. So they're immediately brought in, and you can then entrap them and contain them, work it through, and be separate from them. There is a payoff. I know I keep saying this, but you've brought it up, and it's so important, that you do feel drained by that. But the complex that would cap you will not want to cap itself. So you give it an opportunity, a space within which to perform, and it does it. It goes, it does it. If we separate ourselves from the narrative, so we're not in a method writing mode, it's probably easier for complexes to intrude, because we don't have that direct identification, at least to a certain extent, with the narrative and the engagement with it. It's a process at that point. And when I've talked about this with soap actors, soap, you know, in Britain, Coronation Street, you know, and Emmerdale, we know quite a few from there. It's different for them. They have to become something without identifying with it, because the writing is so inane anyway, that if they did identify with that, they would feel depleted. You know, their own ego, in other words, would deplete and become replaced by that of the character that they're playing in their everyday life, which is, of course, a dangerous thing. So that's the distinction I'm making, that if we can generate a narrative that comes from within a holding space, we can entrap the ego-identified complexes and the others. We can work with deep structure complexes, work with so-called archetypes, certainly meta instincts, feel the affect but leave it. That prevents the complexes from wanting to express themselves, just like in dreams. You know, the dream narrative pulls them in. They're obliged to perform. They act as if they want to, but they're trapped within the dream. The dream ends. So the dream ending is analogous to the contact you have during a session of method writing, and then you leave, and the dream is for now over, and you leave it in there.